In the year 955, the Catholic Church faced an unprecedented crisis. An 18-year-old boy named Octavian was elected to lead the most powerful religious institution in the Western world. He would take the papal name John XII, and his reign would become one of the most controversial in church history, a period that medieval chroniclers would describe with barely concealed horror, and that the church itself would spend centuries attempting to reconcile with its claims of papal authority. To understand John XII, we must first understand the world that created him. Rome, far removed from the spiritual center we might imagine today. By the mid-10th century, the papacy had become thoroughly entangled with temporal power. The Pope was not merely a religious figure but a political ruler who controlled Rome, commanded armies, appointed bishops across Christendom, and wielded influence over kings and emperors. This fusion of spiritual authority and political power created an environment ripe for corruption. John's father, Alberic II, was the patrician of Rome, essentially a secular ruler who controlled the city through military force. For over 20 years, Alberic maintained an iron grip on Roman politics, ensuring that popes were elected who would serve his interests. His mother, Marozia, was herself a legendary figure in Roman politics, known for her role in orchestrating papal elections and manipulating church politics for family advantage. These were the architects of John's destiny. When Alberic died in 954, he extracted a promise from Roman nobility that his son would become the next pope. This wasn't about spiritual leadership, it was about consolidating family power. At 16, Octavian was made a cardinal. 2 years later, following the death of Pope Agapetus II, the teenage Octavian was elected pope, taking the name John XII. The election itself reveals much about the state of the 10th century church. The cardinals who voted for John weren't seeking a spiritual visionary. They were selecting someone young enough to be controlled, connected enough through family to protect their interests, and inexperienced enough not to challenge the existing power structure. They believed they were choosing a puppet. What they got was something far more dangerous. For the first months of his papacy, John XII appeared to fulfill his ceremonial duties. He performed masses, crowned the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, and signed ecclesiastical documents. To outside observers, the young pope seemed to be following established protocols. But inside the Lateran palace, something else was unfolding. According to Liutprand of Cremona, a contemporary chronicler and bishop who lived in Rome during this period, John XII began to abuse his position in ways that shocked even a society accustomed to clerical misconduct. Liutprand's account, written with the care of someone documenting events for posterity, describes how the papal palace became notorious throughout Rome. The power dynamics at play were brutal in their simplicity. In medieval Catholic theology, the Pope was considered the vicar of Christ, God's direct representative on earth. This wasn't merely symbolic. It carried real theological weight. Papal pronouncements were understood as divinely guided. Opposition to the Pope could be construed as opposition to God himself. For a young man suddenly invested with this degree of authority, the temptation must have been overwhelming. John XII discovered that his position placed him beyond conventional accountability. Who could question the Pope? Who could accuse him? Who would even believe accusations against God's chosen representative? This theological framework created a trap not just for John's victims, but for the institution itself. Any acknowledgement that the Pope could commit serious sin would undermine the entire foundation of papal authority. The Church found itself caught between protecting its institutional claims and confronting the reality of John's behavior. The historical record from this period, while incomplete, paints a disturbing picture. Multiple contemporary sources, including ecclesiastical documents from the Synod of Rome in 963, detail accusations of systematic sexual misconduct. These weren't rumors spread by political enemies, they came from within the Church itself, from cardinals and bishops who had witnessed events firsthand. What made John XII's case particularly scandalous was the breadth and audacity of his alleged behavior. He was accused of relationships with married women, widows, and consecrated nunswomen who had taken religious vows of chastity. The violation of these vows was considered especially grave, as it represented not just personal sin but a fundamental assault on sacred commitments. As we'll explore in Part 2, the consequences of John's papacy would force the Church to confront uncomfortable questions about authority, accountability, and the very nature of papal power, questions that would echo through centuries of church history. By 960, John XII's behavior had become impossible to ignore. What began as whispered scandals had grown into open knowledge throughout Rome and beyond. The question was no longer whether something was wrong, but what, if anything, could be done about it. The Synod of Rome in 963 represents a pivotal moment in church history, called by Emperor Otto I, who had grown concerned about the Pope's conduct and political reliability. This ecclesiastical council brought together bishops and cardinals to formally examine charges against John XII. The proceedings of this synod, documented in official church records, provide our most detailed historical evidence. Cardinal Raphael testified that he had personally witnessed John in compromising situations. Benedict, a cardinal deacon, provided corroborating testimony. Other church officials added their accounts, not with the embellishment of gossip, but with the careful precision of legal proceedings. The charges were extensive and grave. They included accusations of sexual relationships with numerous women, including specific allegations regarding his father's former concubine Stephana. More seriously, there were charges of incest involving his sisters and niece, violations that contradicted not just church law but Roman civil law and the natural law principles upon which medieval society was built. Additional accusations included ordaining bishops in exchange for money, consecrating a 10-year-old boy as bishop, and converting church property for personal use. There were also allegations of violent behavior, including the blinding of his confessor and the castration of a cardinal, though these specific claims are harder for modern historians to verify. John XII notably refused to appear before the synod to defend himself. Instead, he sent threatening letters, warning that anyone who participated in his deposition would be excommunicated. This response, threatening the very bishops assembled to judge him, only strengthened the case against him. The synod voted to depose John XII, electing Leo VIII as his replacement. This created a constitutional crisis within the church. Could a church council actually remove a pope? The question touched on fundamental issues of papal authority that wouldn't be fully resolved for centuries. John XII didn't accept his deposition. When Emperor Otto left Rome, John returned with armed supporters, drove out Leo VIII, and reinstated himself as pope. He convened his own synod that reversed all the decisions made against him and punished those who had testified against him. The crisis ended abruptly in May 964 when John XII died, reportedly from a stroke. Some contemporary accounts, possibly embellished by his enemies, claimed he died while committing adultery. More reliable sources simply note that he suffered a stroke and died 8 days later. He was approximately 27 years old. The legacy of John XII's papacy proved profoundly complicated for the Catholic Church. Here was a pope whose conduct was so egregious that a church council had formally documented his crimes. Yet the very act of deposing him raised uncomfortable questions about papal authority. If the pope could be removed for immoral behavior, what happened to claims of papal supremacy? If church councils could judge popes, where did ultimate authority reside? These questions would resurface during later controversies, including the Protestant Reformation, when critics pointed to popes like John XII as evidence that the Church's claims about papal infallibility were historically untenable. Modern historians approach John XII's story with appropriate scholarly caution. The primary sources come from people with various political motivations, particularly Liutprand of Cremona, who served Emperor Otto and had reasons to portray the Pope negatively. Some historians argue that accusations may have been exaggerated for political purposes. However, the sheer consistency of accounts from multiple independent sources, including official church documents, suggests that the core allegations had substantial basis. In fact, the Synod of Rome's proceedings weren't casual gossip, they represented formal ecclesiastical testimony given under oath. What remains historically significant isn't just John XII's personal conduct, but what his papacy revealed about the institutional church in the 10th century. The papacy had become so entangled with secular power that spiritual qualifications had become secondary to political considerations. The election of an 18-year-old with no theological training or spiritual preparation demonstrated how far the institution had drifted from its stated mission. John XII's story also illuminates the medieval understanding of power and accountability. In a system where ultimate authority was vested in a single individual claiming divine mandate, what mechanisms existed for correction when that individual failed? The 10th century church discovered it had no good answer. The papacy would eventually reform, particularly during the Gregorian reform movement of the 11th century, which sought to address exactly the kinds of corruption that John XII exemplified. But his reign stands as a stark reminder of what happens when absolute power combines with human fallibility, a cautionary tale that transcends its medieval context. Today, Pope John XII remains one of the most controversial figures in church history, a teenage pope whose brief, scandalous reign forced uncomfortable questions about authority, power, and human nature that echo through history.